Yeah, continuing with the class, as I have discussed today, we will start with the more MCQs on PPH and shock. You're all able to see the screen, right? The PPT.
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. So I'll straight away go ahead with the questions because last time itself I have revised the theory portion of it, and I think we had discussed until this question. Last time regarding this question, there was a query. I remember one of you had asked me to elaborate on this procedure, that is Fentoni. Okay. So what I would like to tell is like we'll go with this question again. Now, this question was, which one of the following is not an operation for uterine inversion? And as we discussed, uterine inversion is most of the times an acute event. Most of the times it occurs following delivery, especially in the third stage. It is either due to mishandling of the third stage or uterine atony or even adherent placenta. When it is pulled down inadvertently, it will result in uterine inversion, or even a short cord can result in acute uterine inversion. So all these names, whatever you're seeing, are the operative procedures. So the uterine inversion management involves, first of all, resuscitating the patient because she's in a shock and a state of she's already collapsed because of the neurogenic shock mainly there. So you need to resuscitate her, following which you need to start with some conservative methods like immediate repositioning. Once you have diagnosed it, immediately at the time of the delivery you need to repose it as soon as possible by kind of pushing it back. And the procedure which is used to push it back in the sense is called as Johnson's maneuver. Here you can see, and here what you have to remember is the important thing is the part which comes out first has to be reposited last. So for example, the first part to come out is the fundus. So the fundus shouldn't be pushed the first when you're doing the repair back. First thing which has to be pushed is the lower part of the uterus, that is the cervix coming up to the lower uterine segment, then the body of the uterus, and at the last the fundus has to be pushed and reposited back. So that's the principle in this kind of maneuver, that is the Johnson's maneuver. Now, another conservative method is O'Sullivan method. In the O'Sullivan method, it is also called as the hydrostatic O'Sullivan method. What they do here is they push the warm saline. It is run into the vagina with the labias opposed to prevent the leakage, so that the pressure, whatever is created, will naturally and automatically repose the uterus back to its position in a way it has come down. So that is called as the O'Sullivan hydrostatic method, right? So further ahead, if these conservative methods fail, then people have proposed few surgeries for the repair. They include Huntington's procedure and Holtein's method. So in the Huntington's method, as we discussed earlier, what they do is it is a laparotomy procedure. Okay, they open up the abdomen and they hold the uterus. There will be a cup in the uterus, is it not? The uterus will be like it will be dipping down. The as you can see in this picture here, it will be dipping down. So yeah, I'll just show it with the pen. So it will be dipping down here like this. Um, yeah. So what they do is they put the Alice forceps in the cup here, and one on each side. Two Alice forceps are applied like this, and then they give a traction and pull it up backwards. So this is called as Huntington's method. In the Holtein's method, what they do is, as you can see, when the uterus inverts down here like this, there will be a ring which is formed by the cervix. Okay, so cervix will be constricted. It will be contracted kind. So the cervix will form a ring around the inverted uterus here, and the fundus will be lying within this ring or even beyond this ring. So if at all they fail with the Huntington's method in pulling up the fundus back with the help of the Alice, what they have to do is this ring of the cervix, whatever is there, it will be incised mostly posteriorly. Here in the posterior wall, this will be incised. Incised in the sense it will be cut open. The uterus will be cut open. It is nothing but a hysterotomy. So they cut open the cervical ring, and then once the pressure is released, with the help of the two Alice forceps again, they put up the two Alice forceps in this cup near the fundus and then pull it back. Okay, so this is called as Haltein's operation, and then whatever the cut or the incision they have done here, it will be sutured back. So this is Haltein's method. Then similarly, other operations which have been proposed is one is uh, this is called as Spincelli. There is a spelling mistake actually, and when I went through the literature, it is actually Spinelli. So in this Spinelli technique, what they do is it is actually a transvaginal approach. Remember the other two, that is Huntington's and Haltein's, were abdominal approaches, like they were after laparotomy, whereas Spinelli and there is another one which is called as Custer, the Kastner, these are vaginal procedures. Okay, so what they do is here they transect the cervix again. You know, the cervix is transected vaginally. When it is done anteriorly, it is called Spinelli technique, and when the cervix is transect posteriorly, it is called Kastner technique. So both the ways, if the vaginal, what they do is they cut open the cervix either anteriorly or posteriorly, and then they try to release the pressure which is formed by the cervical ring and push it up again. So this is Spinelli and Kastner technique. Here you remember that this Kastner's vaginal approach, where the cervix is cut open posteriorly, is most of the times used for chronic puerperal inversion cases rather than acute inversion cases. So these are again two techniques which you can understand, which are used for the uterine inversion. There is nothing like Fentanyl. Actually, I went through a lot of literature, books, even try to refer the internet, but there is nothing like Fentanyl. Probably it's a wrong name which is being given in this question. It's actually Antonelli. There is something called as Antonelli. Antonelli was one of the surgeons, and his team actually advocated a Celastic cup to facilitate the reduction of the uterine inversion by gentle upward pressure, and this was performed at the time of laparotomy. So what they did was you all remember, have you all seen these elastic cups which are used for vacuum delivery in the vagina, in the normal deliveries, the assisted vaginal deliveries? We use vacuum cups, is it not, for delivering the babies? Have you all seen those cups, the silicone cups?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so there is something like this. The Celastic cups was used by this person, that is Antonelli, where he used it through the laparotomy. They open the abdomen and put that cup on the, that cup which is the depression on the uterus, and with the help of a pressure, they try to pull it up towards by pulling it up. So that is the method which was used, and that has been by Antonelli. It's not Fantoni actually. So this is one technique. Now another thing I would like to update about uterine inversion is that what is the most recent suggestion is they have used even the Bakri balloon. You know, the Bakri balloon is, we'll discuss about it later. It is one of the types of a balloon which is used to intrauterine balloon, where it is inflated and they create the tamponade to prevent the atonic PPH. Okay, so the same Bakri balloon also they've used for management of uterine inversion. What they do here is after the uterine inversion is corrected by any of these conservative methods, okay, so they've used this Bakri balloon to fill up the uterine cavity and maintain the structural integrity of the uterine body by manual repositioning it. So this is the recent advances or recent technique which has been added to the management of the uterine inversion. Now another thing what is new about management of uterine inversion is that sometimes, as we mentioned, because of the uterine atonicity, even after repositioning the uterus, it might recur back. You know, it might again invert after some time because the uterus will not be able to hold up because of the atonicity. So in that case, what they do is this Bakri balloon will prevent the reinversion of the uterus. It will hold the uterus contour and it will prevent the reinversion of the uterus occurring. So this is the most recent suggestion in the management of uterine inversions. So is it clear to all of you? Hello?
Yes,
Right.
ma'am.
So this was about the uterine inversion and the recent advances in that. And I hope everybody is clear with the procedures used for that. So we'll go ahead with the next questions. Now we'll start with this question. I think we did this question last time, but I'll repeat if I don't remember if we ended up here. Now the 20th question was a 30-year-old woman, para 6, delivers vaginally following normal labor with spontaneous delivery of an intact placenta. Excessive bleeding continues despite manual exploration. Bimanual massage, intravenous oxytocin, and administration of 0.2 milligram methergine IV. Which one of the following would be the next step in the management of this patient? A. Packing the uterus. B. Immediate hysterectomy. C. Bilateral internal iliac ligation. Or D. Injection of prostaglandin 2 alpha. Yes, anybody with this answer? Yeah, option D, injection of prostaglandin F2 alpha. I think we discussed last time. See, as we discussed, the PPH is a stepwise management. Here, if you see this patient probably has a tonic, PPH, because they have seen that they have explored the uterus, they have done the bimanual massage, they given oxytocin and methergine, and the next step for the management in this patient is definitely escalating to the next oxytocic, that is the more potent PGF2 alpha or nothing but carboprast. Okay, so all these other options, whatever they have given, are actually the advanced steps what we are supposed to use in spite of patient being given the highest oxytocic, and if in spite of that, if she's still bleeding, then we go ahead with the next procedures. So for as far as this situation is concerned, the option D is the right answer. Okay. We'll go to the next question. Common cause of retained placenta. Is it atonic uterus, constriction ring, placenta accreta, poor voluntary expulsive effort? Which is the most common cause of retained placenta? Anybody?
Atonic uterus.
Yes, atonic uterus is the right answer actually. Here you can see that, because of the atonic uterus, what happens is the uterus fails to contract and retract. So when it fails to contract and retract, the surface attachment of the placenta remains the same. Is it not? So and that's why the placenta does not detach itself from the uterine surface, and it will stay there, and that is the most common cause of retained placenta. All other causes like the constriction ring or the placenta accreta, or of course the poor maternal voluntary expulsive effort, is not at all necessary for the placenta to expel. Okay, so between these two options, these are quite rare, and what they have asked is the common cause. So the answer here is atonic uterus. Okay, so just a brief about retained placenta. Let us discuss what do you mean by retained placenta. It is defined as when the placenta fails to expel even after 30 minutes of the delivery of the fetus. Then we call it as a retained placenta. Okay, so it can be because of a trapped placenta, or it is because of a morbidly adherent placenta. Now, trapped placenta means it is separated, but it is lying within the uterine cavity. It is not coming out of the uterus. So that is called as a trapped placenta. Now, what is the most common cause of retention or of a retention of a separated placenta? It is atonic uterus. Placenta can also get trapped due to constriction ring, that is hourglass contraction, or premature attempts to deliver the placenta before it is separated. Hourglass hourglass contraction of the uterus is a type of constriction ring, and is usually it is produced by prophylactic use of ergometrine, that is methergine, or unnecessary manipulation of the uterus before the delivery of the placenta after the baby delivers. Unnecessary manipulation of the uterus or prophylactic use of ergometrine sometimes we give as a management of third stage of labor at the delivery of the shoulder, baby's shoulder itself. Sometimes it is recommended, and if you give, that will result in constriction ring formation and retention of the placenta. So these are most of the times the precipitating factors. And here you can remember the uterus is hard and contracted, and the internal os is usually closed in case of the cause being a constriction ring for the retained placenta. Okay, So this is about retained placenta and its causes. Next question. A 30-year-old Gravida 3 Para 2 woman delivered a term baby and started bleeding after delivery. She was given IV fluids, but bleeding did not stop. The EMO advised blood transfusion. After how many blood transfusions should be a FFP be given? Anybody? This is actually a more of a pathology question, but the scenario here is that of a PPH or a woman who was delivered, just delivered, and she started bleeding. It means that she's PPH, and she was advised blood transfusion. So, what is the general rule as to whenever you're giving a blood transfusion, whether you have to give Paxils or whole blood or give her FFPs? What is the basic ratio as to how to replace the blood products? Anybody? Yes, students, are you there with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so none of you has an answer for this. It's more of a
No,
pathology
ma'am.
question.
Don't know, ma'am.
Maybe maybe one, ma'am.
Maybe one, no. See, don't just guess. See, what they've asked is after how many blood transfusion should be given FFP? Means if you give one blood transfusion, do you give one FFP? According to your answer.
No, ma'am. Two
Oh,
or
is it not? No. So the answer actually is 4. So once you give 4 pints of blood, they recommend to give at least 1 pint of FFP. Okay, because it's always important to replace the whole blood. But if you don't get whole blood and if you're getting pack cells only, then it is also important that the patient gets the plasma, because all the clotting factors, whatever is necessary, especially are present in the fresh frozen plasma or the plasma content, is it not? So that's why the recommendation is that with every 4 packed cell transfusion or the blood transfusion, you need to provide the patient with 1 pint of FFP. Okay, so the answer here is 4. But as you said, I think somebody suggested 1. The whatever the recommendations are changing. Okay, they are changing every day. Now the recent recommendation is that with every 1 blood packed cell transfusion, we have to give 1 FFP. So we'll once these recommendations are finalized or the guidelines are there, based on that, of course, this is going to change. The answer is going to change. Okay, you can remember and update whenever you're kind of appearing for the exam and what are the latest guidelines. Accordingly, you can do that. Okay. Next question. All of the following are used in management of PPH except blood, FFP, cryoprecipitate, Novo 7. Yes, anybody with this answer? Even you can take a wild guess if you don't know the answer here. Or maybe you can
no,
logically answer this question because you all know that we use blood in PPH. We
no,
use,
seven, ma'am.
yeah, Novo 7 is the right answer, correct. But how did you arrive at Novo 7? Can you elaborate?
Don't know, ma'am. Just wild guess.
Okay, so let's see. Even if you do not know the answer, you should what you should do it when you're answering a multiple choice questions is see that what the options are and how. Sorry.
Ma'am, FFP and cryoprecipitate is a component like blood related, no?
Yes, yes.
Related
So
to
that's
blood.
what. See, blood though you give, it has to be given in a case of PPH. Of course, when we discuss that even the FFP and cryoprecipitate is to be given. Otherwise, what will happen is most of the times the patient, only if you replace blood, and because it's a hemorrhagic shock, if the patient is going into the complete loss of blood is there. So if you replace only blood or the packed cells, then she's not going to get replenished with the necessary clotting factors. What she'll end up in is a dilutional kind of a coagulopathy. Okay, so it's always important that she gets whole blood, or Paxils with FFPs have to be supplemented together. So FFP and cryoprecipitate is given for the same reason, that is to replenish her plasma or the clotting factors, and therefore all the three will be given in the PPH except for this one. Okay, so the answer here is Novo 7, as you rightly told. But anybody knows what is Novo 7? Yes? Anybody knows what is Novo 7?
I think hormone related.
Think hormone, no. So let's see what
Hormone.
is Novo 7 actually. Now, as we discussed, in the case of PPH, we can give colloids or crystalloids. Colloids or crystalloids are these normal IV fluids. Okay, crystalloids are the IV fluids what we give, that is NS, DNS, RL, whatever. Okay, these are the normal crystalloids. Colloids are a little thicker, heavy liquids, and these are available in the market name as Hemacil, and those are colloids. So of course, first line of treatment whenever there is a case of PPH with there is mainly volume loss and blood loss, so you replace it immediately with whatever you have, that is you start with crystalloids and colloids first. Okay, until the time you need to arrange the blood, you need to send the sample, cross match, get it from the blood bank, it will take time. So until then you start off immediately with crystalloids and colloids. These are the first line treatments. Then you have got blood, of course you start with the blood, and as we discussed, with every blood transfused, that is 4 units of blood, we need to give at least 1 unit of fresh frozen plasma, and even platelets can be given if the platelet count is less than 50,000, and cryoprecipitate. So all these are the blood and blood products which can be given in a case of PPH. Now, what is Novo 7 or Novo T? It is actually a activated factor 7. Okay, it's one of the clotting factors. It's a synthetic form of the activated factor 7, and it is given in case of hemophilia and other clotting disorders, but it has no much role in PPH. That is what you should remember. Now, it acts by binding with the tissue factor to augment the intrinsic clotting pathway, and also by activating the factor 9 and 10. Its role in obstetrical hemorrhage, as I discussed, is not proven, and it is not used in these cases. And also, there is a risk of thromboembolic events with this factor 7 administration. Events like even MI have been reported. So that's why it's not of much obstetric significance, but it can be used in other, the clotting disorders, mainly hemophilia is where they have used this Novo T. So remember, Novo T is nothing but an activated factor 7. Clear, all of you? Right, we go with the next question. The triple P procedure for placenta percreta involves all except pelvic devascularization, placental localization using ultrasonography, peripartum hysterectomy, myometrial excision for placental non-separation. Anybody with this answer? Yes? Triple P procedure for placenta percreta. I hope you all understood what is placenta percreta. In the last class, we discussed the placental abnormalities, is it not? So just to go back with the theory, we have placenta accreta, increta, and percreta. These are different grades of abnormal placental attachments, right? Yeah. So these are different grades of attachments of the placenta. Normally, the placenta attaches only up to the decidua basalis, but if there is a deficient decidua basalis or absence in Itabuk's fibrinoid layer, then it will lead to placenta accreta or increta or percreta. Accreta is where it is only attached to the superficial myometrium. The villi are attached only to the superficial myometrium. In increta, they invade the myometrium. In percreta, they invade the full thickness of the myometrium, and even up to serosal layer, they are involved. Okay, so these are the different abnormal placental attachments. Now, what were the risk factors we discussed? There were like previous cesarean section is very important risk factor. Any damage to the uterus in the form of cesarean section, curettage, previous manual removal of placenta, Asherman syndrome, synovitis, myomectomy, or even maternal advanced age are the risk factors for placenta accreta. How is it diagnosed? Mainly at the time of delivery, when the placenta normally does not separate out, then is the time where you realize that there is a placental abnormal attachment, either in the form of accreta or increta. And prior to the delivery, in the antenatal period, we can diagnose the presence of the placenta accreta by some of the investigations, mainly imaging, by transvaginal sonography. Now, these are the features which will tell that probably there is a placenta accreta. One is visualization of irregular vascular sinuses with turbulent flow at the placental and uterine interface, myometrial thickness less than 1 mm at the placental attachment site, and the absence of the subplacental sonolucent zone. Sonolucent means, as I discussed, it's a black area which is present in between the placenta and the uterine wall. So if this is absent, it indicates the absence of the normal deciduum basalis, and therefore there might be a risk for placenta accreta. So these are the features on sonography which might predict the placenta accreta during the antenatal period. And of course, MRI is the standard diagnosis where you can correctly diagnose how much is the involvement of the placental attachment within the myometrium, and whether it is a placenta accreta, increta, or even percreta can be clearly diagnosed on MRI. Now, coming back to this question, as we discussed about the theory or the features of the placenta accreta here. So there is something called as triple P procedure for placenta percreta. So which of the following is not what I've asked is which of the following is not the procedure involved in triple P procedure indicated? Anybody has an idea about this? So you can see here, there is one common thing amongst the three of the options. One is pelvic devascularization, means these are serially ligating the blood vessels which are supplying the uterus, that is the uterine artery, ovarian artery, and even the internal iliac artery. So that is called as pelvic devascularization, which is a conservative procedure utilized for management of the PPH, is it not? So that is pelvic devascularization. Then placenta localization using ultrasonography means before going ahead with the cesarean section, or before planning for a cesarean section, we go ahead with the ultrasonography in the antenatal period or on the table and see where is the placenta is. And once we locate the placenta, what we do is like we take an incision away from the placenta. We don't go through the placenta. We avoid the placenta as much as possible, especially if it's an anterior located placenta. We take an incision beyond the placenta and then deliver the baby out. Okay, that is also a strategy which is used in the management of placenta percreta, which is diagnosed in the antenatal period. Then the third option is peripartum hysterectomy. Is actually it's a last resort, in the sense it is not a conservative procedure. Okay, whereas the last option, that is myometrial excision for placental non-separation, in the sense what they do here is wherever the placental attachment is there into the myometrium, they try to excise only that portion of the myometrium if it's possible. And if it's present, especially in the lower uterine segment, they try to excise that portion of the myometrium along with the placenta. They take it out and then suture back the uterus, the two layers of the uterus. So this is again a conservative procedure. So if you can observe, even if you do not know the answer, observe that all the three options, A, B, and D, are conservative approaches for the management of the placenta percreta, whereas peripartum hysterectomy is an absolute a last resort as a surgical procedure where the woman has to end up with a hysterectomy. Okay, so with just simple observation and just the simple common sense, if you can think, then this is what is standing out, in the sense it is not belonging to the other three kind of conservative procedures, is it not? So the answer here is actually C. that is the peripartum hysterectomy. So this is not a part of the triple P procedure which has been recommended for the management of placenta percreta. So this forms the last resort of management of placenta percreta. Other three are the conservative approaches which have been included in the triple P procedure for the management. So is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So we'll go ahead with the next question. So as we discussed the same thing, it consists of 3 steps: perioperative placental localization, pelvic devascularization, and placental non-separation is dealt with myometrial excision and reconstruction of the uterus. Right, next question. This is a very simple one. We have discussed about these procedures in the previous classes. Now identify the suture shown plate used for management of PPH. Is it a Behling suture, Heyman suture, Choskwas sutures, or Gunshila suture? Is anybody?
B-Lynch?
Behling, yes, is the right answer. Can you explain how it has, how you can say that it's a Behling suture?
I just remember the image, ma'am.
Okay, fine. I'll try to explain the different sutures. Now, all these sutures are what we call it as the uterine compression sutures. You know what they do is they especially used in atonic PPH, where the uterus is not contracting and retracting. So we try to manually compress them and see that they stay compressed so that the bleeding stops. Okay, and many a times it's very successful, and we avoid even hysterectomy by using these procedures before. Okay, so there are different people have suggested different kind of sutures. The most commonly what we use is the Behling suture, right? And then there are different people like Heyman suture, Choskwa sutures, and Gunshila sutures. So previously when we discussed about the sutures, the compression sutures, now regarding the different kind, I'll just show you the pictures right here. So these are compression sutures. They are the steps followed before we end up in hysterectomy. Now in this Behling suture, you can see that what we do is we take during the cesarean section, when the uterus is opened like this, you can see the anterior wall of the uterus here, and the suture material what we use for all these kind of compression sutures is an absorbable suture. Remember, we never use a non-absorbable suture. It's always an absorbable suture, mainly the Vicryl what we get, and we use the same thing for uterine closure. The same material is used. So in Behling suture, what they do is they take an incision from the anterior wall of the uterus. They go inside the cavity, come out. Okay, come out at this level above the upper lip of the uterus. When you have taken an incision, come out like this, and then they take it over the fundus of the uterus, and you can see here, once they come out on the fundus down here, they come back down, and then they pierce again into the uterine cavity, go horizontally, come out through the next side, that is on the opposite side, and then they suspend it again over the fundus, take an incision inside the uterus again, and come out lower side, and then they tie it here uh, in front of the incision. Okay, so at the end you'll be able to see this picture where the uterus is suspended, it is pulled down, and you can see the Behling suture tied here, and this is the uterine incision which is closed. So is it clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to show a video of the same procedures so that it's much easier for you to understand. I'll just try to open up the windows if it's possible. Just let me know if you're able to see these. Okay. Now this is. Are you able to see this video? Hello, students.
No, ma'am.
You're not able to see the video?
No, ma'am.
Okay, I think we cannot play the live YouTube videos when we are taking the live classes like this. Then I just wanted to try and show you these videos. So probably we'll have to include those in our presentation and then play them in the presentation. So it's not possible to play these live videos, I guess, in the class. You're not able to see the video?
No, ma'am. Only PPT. Suture.
Okay, fine. So as I explained, I hope you understood how they do this. Okay. What I'll do is I'll share the link of these videos on YouTube so that you can understand them much better. Okay, so this is the B-link suture, which is most commonly used. Now, what they do in Heyman suture is, in this picture, you can see this Heyman suture. What they do is they just take incision or they pierce the needle from the anterior wall of the uterus, take it directly back it from the directly out from the piercing the posterior wall. They take it directly posteriorly. Okay, they just through and through pass the anterior directly posterior wall and then they come out, and then they tie it on the fundus compressing the uterus. Same thing, second suture they do it on the left side also. So they both right and left side they take a simple suture like this and compress and tie it on the fundus. This is Heyman suture. Okay, now there is one more, this Kunshila, which has been described by her. She was a great infertility specialist in Bangalore. She did this global stitches, global in the sense she took transverse stitches on the uterus, starting from lower uterine segment up till the fundus. Okay, and then tied them up posteriorly. They are like round sutures, taking from posterior, anterior, anterior, posterior, and then tying it posteriorly. So these are multiple layered global stitches, which was used by, shown by Gunshila. So this is one technique. This is the Heyman's technique. But remember, this is the 4 squares where they take sutures like anterior to posterior and then posterior to anterior and tie them. So 4 such sutures or squares are done and then they are tied up separately. So this is Cho square sutures. So as I told, the most common what we use is the B-link suture. Okay, so is it clear to all of you different kinds of compression sutures? Any doubt in that? Okay, so we'll proceed with the further questions. Right. Causes of uterine atony include which of the following? A, obesity, B, placenta previa, C, multiple fetuses, or D, placental abruption. Which of the factors mentioned here predisposes for uterine atony? Anybody?
Multiple feet.
Yeah, that's the right answer. We discussed previously, is it not? So whenever there is an overdistension of the uterus, either because of the multiple fetuses, polyhydramnios, or a macrosomic baby, because of the hyperstretching or overstretching of the uterus, the muscle fibers would have lost their contractility capacity sometimes, and therefore most of the times they are the predisposing factors after delivery. There is a very high incidence of postpartum hemorrhage in such cases, okay, wherever there is an overdistension of the uterus. So here the answer, the multiple fetuses, is right. Okay. Next, which of the following maneuvers should be performed in the setting of postpartum hemorrhage following a vaginal delivery? Evaluate birth canal for lacerations. Evaluate the placenta for possible retained fragments. The uterus should be manually explored and placental fragments removed. D, all of the above. Yes?
All of the above.
All of the
Yes,
above.
all of the above, is it not? So whenever there is a PPH, the first thing we do is, as I told, keep your left hand on the uterus and see that it is contracted or no. Okay, that is the first thing you do. Second thing is you have to look for any retained products of placenta or the fragments, and by doing a manual examination. And of course, if at all there is a contracted uterus or if there is no retained products, then you look for vaginal lacerations or the birth canal lacerations, even vulval lacerations, for the cause of the bleeding. So you have to do all these 3 procedures at a one by one. You have to do these and rule out the cause for the postpartum hemorrhage. Okay, so the answer is all of the above. Next, during evaluation of postpartum hemorrhage following a vaginal delivery, which of the following maneuvers or medications might be used? Bimanual uterine compression, ergot alkaloids for patients with hypertension, carboprost, methamine in patients with mild asthma, all of the above. Yes? Yes, what is the answer here? Students, are you all there with me? I hope there is no disconnection because I'm not getting any answer from you.
Yes, ma'am.
So why are you so quiet? Is it so confusing? It's a very easy answer.
Ma'am,
All of
bimanual
them.
uterine compression.
Yes, of course, bimanual uterine compression is the answer. Now, this is also the right answer for this question. See, bimanual uterine compression you definitely do, is it not, for the postpartum hemorrhage? Okay, so this is one of the important maneuvers you do. Immediately putting your hand on the abdomen and one in the vagina, you try to compress the uterus and hold up the, the bleeding for some time until you have other help. Okay, now here two of these statements, if you analyze, ergot alkaloids are nothing but products like methergine and ergometrin. Okay, so one of the very important contraindication for these ergot alkaloids is hypertension, is it not? So any given time, you all will be able to remember that hypertension is one condition where we do not give methergine or ergot alkaloids. Okay, so that's a very important contraindication. So you need to remember. So we don't give it in hypertension. So this is a false answer. Similarly, asthma. Okay, asthma is one condition, even though it is mild, just they've written it to confuse you people. Mild asthma, remember any patient with asthma, mild or moderate or severe, you never give carboprost. Carboprost is nothing but PGF2 alpha. Okay, because this will cause sudden pulmonary spasms and alveolar spasms. That's why you never give or you should not give carboprost in patients with asthma. Okay, so these are the two important contraindications you should remember for these two important drugs, and then of course it will be easier for you to answer this question. Okay, another thing what you have to remember is carboprost or the carboprost is always given as an intramuscular injection. It's never given as an intravenous injection. Okay, that is one important thing you should remember. So is it all clear to all of you? I hope there is no confusion regarding the drugs used or the oxytocics used for the uterus. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So we'll proceed then. Now the next question, a 30-year-old Gravida 3 Para 3 begins having brisk, bright red bleeding following completion of a vaginal delivery. You give her carboprost tromethamine and perform the maneuver pictured below. What else should be immediately considered? Call for help, ask for urgent help from anesthesia, place a large bore intravenous lines, order blood, and begin volume resuscitation, all of the above. Yes, students?
All of the above.
Yes, of course, all of the above, is it not? So all of the things has to be done simultaneously, as I've stressed many times. PPH is a condition where first thing you do is call for help. Okay, so of course you have to do all these things simultaneously. You have to put an IV line, get the blood ordered, and also begin resuscitation until the blood reaches her. So all the things have to be done simultaneously. The answer is all of the above here. Okay. And what they're doing here, which is the procedure, what they're doing here? Yes, students? What is the procedure being done in the picture? Yes, anybody? Quick answer, please. Hello? Yeah, you are all there with me. I hope there is no disconnection.
We can hear, ma'am.
Okay. So what is this procedure which is shown in the picture here? Yes? They're compressing the uterus in between the two hands, is it not? You can see one hand is in the vagina with the fist made, right hand, and the left hand is holding the uterus in between the fingers, the thumb and the rest of the fingers. They're trying to compress it from both above as well as below. Okay, so this is bimanual compression of the uterus. So this is one of the first procedures immediately once you diagnose an atonic PPH, you try to put your hands in this way and compress the uterus and prevent the further blood loss. This is bimanual uterine compression. Okay. Shall we proceed to the next question? Are you all there? Is there a delay in connecting? I'm not able to receive any of your responses.
No,
We,
ma'am,
we
it's
can hear,
fine.
ma'am.
Okay, fine. So we'll proceed further. I want you to be interactive. I want you to be responding to me so that, you know, I don't feel like I'm just talking to myself here. Okay, please be active and quick, right? So we'll proceed to the next question. The patient in question 4110, that is the previous question here, the same patient they're talking about, continues bleeding after the intravenous interventions mentioned above. Which of the following maneuvers might be employed? Hysterectomy, Bakri balloon replacement, placement, uterine compression sutures, all of the above. Yes? So once the conservative procedures or the conservative interventions fail, what is the next step the patient can be proceeded for? So what are the procedures we can do for her to save her life or to see that she doesn't bleed anymore?
All of them we can do, ma'am.
Yeah, all of them we can do, is it not? So if the questions here, you should read it properly. They've just asked which of the following maneuvers might be employed. So we can do any of these, you know, depending on how serious the condition is. But if they would have asked the same question in the way that which is the next step to be done after doing the previous interventions, then the answer would be a next conservative procedure, that is something like a Bakri balloon placement, which is done vaginally. So we'll discuss about that in few next slides. So the next step would be Bakri balloon replacement. Then if that doesn't help her, if she's still not stable with that, the next step would be going for the uterine compression sutures, which is a conservative procedure, and hysterectomy will be the last procedure. Okay, so it's very important to analyze what is the situation given and then what is the question they have asked. If they have asked which is the next step, then according to the chronological order for the management of the PPH, you should be able to answer that. Here they've asked which one might be employed, so the answer here would be all of the above can be used or might be used. So is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So the next one here, the patient is question 4110, undergoes a hysterectomy and 5 units of Packard cells are given, but bleeding continues. What is the most likely etiology of the bleeding in this case? A. Vaginal cuff bleeding, B. Dilutional coagulopathy, C. Lacerated internal iliac artery, or D. Placental implantation on the omentum. Yes, we did.
Dilutional coagulopathy.
Yeah,
Dilute.
correct. Dilutional coagulopathy is the right answer here because you all remember we discussed about you know how important it is to replace 4 units after at least 4 units of blood. We need to replace at least with 1 FFP so that you know the patient will get the proper coagulation factors in the plasma as well. Otherwise, she will end up in dilutional coagulopathy, is it not? So here specifically they have given that she's already undergone hysterectomy. So there is no more kind of, problem related to any other causes. And specifically, they mentioned that 5 units of blood is given. Okay, so that gives us the hint that they want specifically related to complication where the patient has not been replaced with adequate blood products in the form of both red blood cells or the packed red blood cells as well as the FFPs. So the answer here is B, dilutional coagulopathy. Okay. Next one. Regarding the patient in question, same question, that is 4110. Which of the following interventions might have avoided or ameliorated this condition? That means the previous condition, that is a dilutional coagulopathy. They are talking about dilutional coagulopathy. So which of these interventions would have prevented dilutional coagulopathy? A, transfusion of platelets, transfusion of whole blood, infusion of 5% albumin for initial resuscitation, all of the above. What is the answer here? Which of the following interventions might have avoided the dilutional coagulopathy? Is it only transfusion of platelets or transfusion of whole blood or infusion with 5% albumin?
All of the above.
All of the above cannot be the answer, because just giving by just giving platelets, would that condition be prevented, the dilutional coagulopathy? She will need other blood, the coagulation factors as well, is it not? So just giving platelet transfusion wouldn't have prevented that dilutional coagulopathy. What she needed is, of course, if they would have given an option of FFP, that would have been the best answer. But they've given one more option, that is transfusion of whole blood. So the patient was given 5 units of packed cells. Remember in this question, see, 5 units of packed red cells has been given. They've not given her whole blood or even FFP. Okay, so if they would have given the whole blood, that includes both the plasma as well as the red blood cells, then of course we would have prevented the complication what they're asking, that is a coagulation, dilutional coagulopathy. Do you all agree with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So as we discussed here, infusion of 5% albumin alone, of course, it will not going to help to prevent this complication. Okay. And transfusion of only platelets also is not going to prevent this complication. So how they would have prevented is by giving whole blood in this particular patient of PPH. So always remember, it is better to give whole blood in case of a PPH. Okay. Where the plasma is also replaced along with the red blood cells. So that will prevent the further complications like dilutional coagulopathy and subsequent continuous bleeding for this patient. Okay, so is it all clear for all of you? No doubts in this? Yeah. Next one. Now, what is represented in the following image? Buckrey balloon, Foley catheter, Blakemore tube, or Jackson-Pratt drain? Anybody?
Mostly Buckrey balloon, ma'am.
Mostly Buckrey balloon. Yeah. See, since this class is based on PPH, now you can easily tell that this is a Buckrey balloon. Okay. If it were to be a general exam question, then you would have got confused. Right. So mainly you could have got confused between Buckrey balloon and Foley catheter because they are similar. Is it not? Like you can see they have a bulb and the tube is there, and then they have the inlet and the outlet. Is it not? So these two are almost similar. But remember, Buckrey balloon is made of silicone. Okay, most of the time the Buckrey balloon is made of silicone, and you can see the white material, that is a silicone. And Foley's is usually whatever we use in the Indian scenario is again a kind of a latex rubber which is used. So that's how you can kind of differentiate between Foley catheter and a Buckley balloon. And of course, the Blakemore tube and Jackson Pratt will not be looking similar, and therefore you won't be much confused about these two. But you need to understand each of these different devices and for what they're used. So let's discuss about that for some time. Where is, of course, Buckley balloon is used for management of PPH, where they inflate the balloon within the uterine cavity so that it creates a tamponade and prevents the further bleeding. Foley catheter, all of you know, where is it used? Foley catheter?
Catheterization, ma'am.
Yes?
Paralyzed patients.
Bladder
Catheterization.
catheterization, yes, fine. Where is this Blakemore tube used? Yes, students?
Esophageal bleeding.
Correct. That is also, it's the first name is Sengstaken Blakemore tube. It is used for controlling the esophageal bleeding in the esophageal varices. So again, it works with the same technique of tamponade. That's the Sengstaken Blakemore tube. Then coming to the last option, what is this? JP drain, Jackson Pratt drain. Where is this used? Yes. Anybody? The name says drain, so it will be used to drain something within the body. Okay, so just remember that. So it doesn't need to have a kind of a balloon to inflate or be in place. Okay, so that's how you can kind of rule this option out, that is Jackson Pratt drain. Okay, so quickly we'll go through this now. As we discussed, Beckery balloon. Okay, so this was invented by Dr. Eunice Beckery. You can see here the actual tube, and it is made up of 24 French gauge, 54 centimeter long. It is a silicone catheter, and the capacity is 500 ml. Okay, so the device is used to temporarily control and reduce the postpartum hemorrhage. So as you can see, what they do is they insert it vaginally through the cervix, and then they inflate the balloon almost up to, we can use up to 300 to 500 ml of the capacity, as much as it is accommodating. So what you can see here, when the balloon is inflated, it will sit correctly along the contour of the uterine cavity inside, and then it will kind of put pressure or tamponade on all the walls of the whole of the surface of the uterine wall or the endometrium. So that's how it will kind of put pressure and prevent the further bleeding occurring. So this is about the Beckery balloon, right? Now, Foley catheter, you all know it's used for the catheterization of the bladder and for monitoring the urine output. Okay, then coming to the Sengstaken Blakemore tube, as you told rightly, it is used for controlling the esophageal varices or the bleeding. What they do is they insert through the nasogastric tube in the semi-follow position, and they insert it into the stomach. One bulb is inflated within the stomach, and the other one is inflated in the esophagus. This one creates a tamponade on the esophageal wall, and therefore prevents the further bleeding. Okay, so this is about the Sengstaken Blakemore tube. Then coming to this last one, that is the JP drain, as we were discussing. Here it is used to drain any of the cavities within the body, mainly in the abdominal cavity post surgery. If there is any collection, this kind of drains are used. It is a closed drain, remember, and it is a negative suction drain. Okay, so they kind of squeeze it, create a negative pressure, insert it in a similar surgical procedure, and then inflate it and allow the fluid collected to drain out. So this is the drain what is been mentioned there, and that's how you can remember and try to come to the correct answer for this particular question. So everybody is clear with the different kinds of the tubes and the catheters mentioned there. No confusion.
Yes,
Right.
ma'am.
At this
It's
point,
clear
I would
now.
also like to mention there is one more device what we used in postpartum hemorrhage. It's called as a non-pneumatic NSAG, non-pneumatic anti-gravity suit. Okay. So earlier, this was the suit which was used in case of astronauts whenever they would go into a blacking out area to prevent extreme acceleration, what they would use this kind of pneumatic anti-gravity suit so that it could push the blood from the lower part of the body back to the upper part of the body, and it wouldn't result in hypoxemia to the brain. So that was actually designed, this particular suit was designed for astronauts, but later on a few people, especially in Africa, they started using it for preventing the blood loss or preventing the exaggeration of the shock in case of postpartum patients, resulting in postpartum hemorrhage. So then that's how this has been regularly being used in emergency situations. Even in WHO, it has been recommended, and people are trained to get used to this kind of pneumatic anti-gravity suit, and it is mostly kept in stock in peripheral health centers, where they can wrap up the patient in this suit, and they can transfer her. So what will happen when the patient is wrapped, she's wrapped from the lower down, okay, only from the waist onwards up till the feet, she's wrapped up, and they have numbered the different flaps to be put correctly so that there is no confusion, and it's very easy for people, the healthcare workers, to wrap it up immediately matching the numbers. Okay, so they wrap it completely from the waist lower down onwards, so it will cause a compression and squeeze the blood whatever is there in the lower body up to the upper body and the brain. So that's how it will prevent further hypoxemia and collapse of the patient in case of extreme postpartum hemorrhage and shock. So is it all clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
It's also called as PPH suit or even NSAG suit or the anti-gravity suit. Okay. So we'll go to the next question. Now, the following picture unfortunately depicts a maternal death after postpartum hemorrhage. Which of the following are possible contributors? Placenta previa, uterine rupture, uterine inversion, or chorioamnionitis? Anybody? What you can see in the picture here? Something is like
Placenta.
There is a confusion whether it is a placenta or what else it could be. What else it could be? Immediately after delivery, some mass coming out like this. Okay, one is the placenta. Second is uterus, is it not? Something which is coming out like this is either the placenta, or in a rare situations, it could be the uterus itself. That is nothing but uterine inversion. Okay. See, in this picture, you can see that there is something lying outside the vagina or the introitus. Okay. So the options what they've given here is placenta previa and uterine rupture. There is nothing coming out here in placenta previa or uterine rupture. Is it not? So something which is coming out like this through the introitus, it has to be either the placenta after delivery or the uterus itself, as in uterine inversion. And chorioamnionitis, of course, this is not the option, relevant option at all here for this particular picture. So you can easily rule out all the three options, and the answer here is uterine inversion. Is it not? Had they given an option like a placenta, or even a retained placenta or whatever, then there would have been confusion. But since the three options are ruled out, the answer is uterine inversion for this particular question. Okay. Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. We'll go to the next question. Now, what percentage of women have lacerations at the time of vaginal delivery? 50%, 90%, 80%, or 65%? This is a theoretical question. So if anybody knows it well, can answer. If not, I'll just give you the answers. Anybody? Is it common or not common having lacerations, women having vaginal delivery? It's common. So it has to be either 90% or 80%. Is it not? It cannot be just 50% or 65%. So that's how you can rule out two options and zero in on two options. Okay. So now the confusion will be between 90% and 80%. Okay, so just a wild guess, you can think 90% will be too much. So maybe 80% is the right answer. Is it not?
Yes, ma'am.
So that's how you can sometimes try to guess if you don't remember the exact figures or the facts. You can try to kind of use logical or the work experience what you have when you are posted in a labor room. You would have seen like if there are about 10 deliveries in your shift, like at least 6 to 7 of them would have had a laceration. If the proper episiotomy is given, fine. If not, then even though the episiotomy is given, they would have end up having small lacerations, especially the vaginal lacerations. Is it not? So just with your routine experience also, you can try to answer these questions sometimes. So the answer here is 80%. Okay, 80% of the women with vaginal delivery tend to have lacerations in one or the other form. Okay. Now the next question. Which maneuvers below should be performed when repairing a cervical laceration? Operator grasps lips of the cervix with ring forceps. Second assistant can provide better exposure with vaginal wall retractors. Assistant place downward pressure on the uterus to expose the cervix better for the operator. All of the above can be done. Yes?
All of the above, ma'am.
Yeah, all of the above. That's the right answer because you need all these things to be in place whenever you're doing a cervical laceration repair, is it not? So ring forceps they mentioned here. What we use here is the sponge forceps. It's the same one. The ring forceps or the sponge forceps is same. Those are the ones, the instruments what we use to hold the cervix immediately after delivery. Okay, so that's how it is. And of course, we need an assistant for us to properly show the laceration. The vaginal wall have to be retracted. Either we do it with sim speculum, or we can even use the retractors. The right angle retractor sometimes also can be used. Most of the times we use 2 or 3 sim speculums and try to retract the both the sides of the vaginal walls so that the cervix is exposed properly. Then of course with the pressure on the uterus on the above from the fundus, when the cervix is slightly pushed below, it will be easier for us to get to the edge of the laceration on the cervix, get to the end of the the laceration. So that's how all these procedures or all these points are important when we are doing a cervical laceration repair. Okay, next one. What is the appropriate management of vulvovaginal hematomas? Surgical exploration in all cases. B, to prevent infection, they should all undergo ultrasound guided drainage. C, in a small hematoma, if pain is severe, then ice packs and analgesia are appropriate. D, if bleeding ceases, small to moderate sized hematomas can be treated expectantly. What do you think is the right answer for this question? Do you need to do surgical exploration in all cases?
No, ma'am.
No, so this option is ruled out. Now, to prevent infection, should they undergo ultrasound guided drainage? What do we do to prevent infection?
Give antibiotics, ma'am.
Yeah, give antibiotics. So we don't have to do ultrasound in all the cases, is it not? So this is not the correct answer. Now, in a small hematoma, if the pain is severe, then ice packs and analgesia are appropriate.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this can be the answer. Now, remember, the hematoma is small, so the pain sometimes could be not relevant here. Okay, they have given severe pain. So in small hematomas, usually there won't be severe pain. So that's why you can say that this statement is not very correct. Okay, so the pain occurs only when the hematoma increases because of the stretching of the skin there. When there is a big hematoma, only then the patient will end up in severe pain. So small hematomas, usually the patient won't have much pain. So she may not even need ice pack or even analgesia. So this statement is also actually not a right statement. Okay, do you all agree with me or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So then the last option, that is the D option, is right actually. See, whenever there is a bleeding, if the bleeding ceases, means stops. Small to moderate sized hematomas can be treated expectantly. That means we need not explore and open up the hematomas and see, look for, where the bleeder is and try to suture and all that. That will cause more pain, more complication, and more rate of infection sometimes. So when there are small to moderate sized hematomas and you're sure that it is not increasing in time, that means that the bleeding is not going to, that there is no further bleeding within the hematoma, then you just treat them expectantly by giving them proper antibiotics, proper analgesia, and proper packs. So the ice packs can be given and treated expectantly. So this is actually the appropriate management for the vulvovaginal hematomas. Okay, so do you all agree? It's all clear for you all? So another thing what you remember is in cases of vulvovaginal hematomas immediately after delivery or postpartum, most of the times the patient will present with a very severe pain, onset of pain. Okay, so when you are doing the suturing of the lacerations, you would have sutured everything and you would have missed some bleeder inside or outside. And after about half an hour, 1 hour, the patient complains of severe pain. So whenever the patient is complaining of severe pain, sudden onset of severe pain, it is always important to again re-examine and look for the presence of any of these hematomas, especially the vulval or the vaginal hematomas, which are stretching the skin and causing a lot of pain to the patient. So it is always very important whenever a patient is complaining of severe sudden onset pain, look if there has been any hematoma formed with on the perineum or the vulva. So that is an important point you have to remember here. Okay. So same question related to that. The hematoma in the following picture is in which location? Is it ischiorectal hematoma, periurethral hematoma, supraelevator hematoma, a left-sided anterior perineal triangle? Yes, anybody?
Left side.
Yes?
Option D, ma'am.
Option
B.
B, that B for the periurethral hematoma.
No, ma'am. Last one, left side.
Last one, left-sided anterior perineal triangle. Okay, so the answer could be both periurethral hematoma or even the left-sided anterior perineal triangle. Okay, see, remember it's not ischiorectal because ischiorectal means it has to be in the ischiorectal area, that is the rectum here, and this is the ischium. So this is ischiorectal. Periurethral, it could be periurethral because you can see the urethral position is here and it's surrounding the urethra. So it's starting from here and expanding into, the skin in the labia major and minora. So it could be a periurethral hematoma. Okay, it can't be a supraelevator hematoma because it is clearly seen outside. Okay, so it's not a supraelevator hematoma. And as you said, it could be a left-sided anterior perineal triangle hematoma as well. So the perineal triangle, if you take, it is divided into posterior and anterior. So it could be a left-sided anterior perineal triangle, as I mentioned, but most commonly it is the periurethral hematoma, which is seen in this area, and it swells up in the area of the the labia majora. Okay. Is it clear? We'll proceed. Now, which of the following statements are true concerning morbidly adherent placentas? Caesarean scar pregnancies are precursors to a morbidly adherent placenta. Placenta villi attached to smooth muscle fibers rather than to residual cells. Abnormal placental adherence is in part due to partial or total absence of nitabuclear. All of the above. Yes? Morbidly adherent placentas are nothing but placenta accreta, increta, or the percreta, right? So when we have discussed about those conditions, the risk factors, when we read about that, is Caesarean scar a risk factor for morbidly adherent placenta or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so this is the right option, is it not? So most common precursor for a morbidly adherent placenta is a cesarean section. Remember that the cesarean section scar is most of the times the most commonly predisposing or precursor for adherent placenta. Now, second option, you see the placental villi, they are attached to the smooth muscle fibers, is it not? Because these kind of adherent placenta are caused because of the lack of the which layer of the placenta or the uterus? It's the, yes, we discussed about all this. It's the decidua basalis, is it not? So the decidua basalis is absent there, and that's why rather than attaching to the residual cells, what happens is the placental villi get attached to the smooth muscles directly. They enter into the myometrium, is it not? So this is also the right statement for this question. Now, of course, the last one, because the absence of the interbux layer, there will be the placental adherence, is it not? This is a important pathological feature of adherent placentae. So absence of the decidua basalis and partial or total absence of interbux layer. So all the three statements are right. Do you all agree or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So the answer here will be all of the above. Okay. Now, next question. The picture below represents which of the following placental pathologies? Placenta increta, accreta, percreta, or abruption? So this is a picture of a cesarean section, and you can see this is the uterus, and this is the placenta, which they have kind of here. This is a uterine incision. Okay, this is a uterine incision. They deliver the baby, and the placenta is getting delivered here. But what you can see here is a big swelling on the other side, on the other surface of the uterus, and it's like almost just covered by the shining serosa of the uterus. So what is this condition?
Placenta percreta.
Patrita.
Yeah, it's clear, right, for all of you in the picture? The answer is
Yes.
percreta. Percreta means it is invaded whole of the myometrium and even up to the serosal layer of the uterus. Can you see? So
Yes,
the
ma'am.
answer here is placenta percreta. It's all clear for everyone? Don't get confused. See, this is the uterus of the delivery. You can see the incision of the uterus here, and through that the placenta is actually getting delivered, but the placental attachment or even perforation is there in this part here. Clear to all of you? We'll go with the next question. Which hemostatic surgical procedure is to be performed in the picture? B-Lynch procedure, uterine artery ligation, vaginal artery ligation, or ovarian artery ligation? Yes, students, are you all there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so what are you seeing here? What is this? What is this structure here you're seeing? It's the uterus, is it not? This is a picture of a case in cesarean section. You can see the Doynes, which is retracting the bladder here, and this is the uterus. Okay, and you can see the sutures here.
Yes, ma'am.
So the uterus, this is post-delivery cesarean section. Immediately after delivery, they have sutured the uterus. The incision on the uterus is closed. Okay, and they have taken out the uterus out of the abdomen. They're holding it with their hand. You can see on one side there is this. What is the structure here? What you can see? Can you all see?
Yes, ma'am.
What is this? What you're seeing here? The shiny long thing here, reddish thing.
Fallopian tube, ma'am.
Yeah, this is a fallopian tube, and behind that is the ovary here, you can see. So this is a part of the left adnexa. And when you trace it down, what you're seeing here, this whole structure is the Broad ligament, is it not? Below the fallopian tube is a broad ligament. And what they're doing is they're trying to, whenever you are taking the incision on the uterus, remember it is taken in the lower uterine segment. Okay, so it's the lower uterine segment where the incision is taken, and what they're doing is they're trying to kind of clamp at this level in the broad ligament. So what is the structure which is coming here? Which artery comes here? At the level of the, from where the internal os is here, and then it is going up like this, and you're trying to clamp it. Which is the structure which will be coming in the broad ligament?
Ovarian artery.
What? Ovarian artery comes in the broad ligament? See here, the broad ligament is on the lower side of the broad ligament. They're putting the clamp here. Ovarian artery will come in the ovarian ligament. See, this is the ovary. Somewhere if you open up the flap like that, then here will be the ovarian artery. What's here, which is coming from below upwards, is the uterine artery. Is it not? So what the procedure they're trying to do here is they're going to trying to ligate the uterine artery here. So the uterine artery ligation is done bilaterally whenever you want to do the serial devascularization of the uterus for the postpartum hemorrhage. They do first the bilateral uterine artery ligation. Okay. So I'll just use the pen here. They try to locate the uterine artery by feeling the pulsations, and then we take a nick here in the broad ligament, you know, just inside the uterine artery, and ligate and tie it off here. So same thing is done here. See, you can imagine this is the broad ligament retracting the bladder. This is the lower uterine segment. Here is the uterine incision, and they're trying to ligate here. You can see the artery here. Is it not? Can you see the artery here? Right. So they are keeping the artery at the almost at the level of the lower uterine segment, where the uterine artery traverses up here. So they're trying to ligate here on this side, and of course we do it on the other side as well. Why are you getting confused with ovarian artery? Remember, this is the ovary, this is the tube, and if you can draw the picture of the the uterus, the round ligament, fallopian tube, and the ovary here, and the structure which is coming up like a fan like a thing here, this is a broad ligament, and here the ovary is attached to the pelvic structure, that is actually the infundibulopelvic ligament, and the ovary attached to the uterus is the ovarian ligament. So the ovarian artery traverses the ovarian ligament here, not from the lower down broad ligament. So the structure here is uterine artery, here is the ovarian artery. Okay, and as we discussed previously in the anatomy, ovarian artery is a branch of the which artery? Ovarian artery is a branch of which artery?
Internal
Yes.
iliac.
Yeah, internal iliac artery, is it not? So here, this is a very superficial thing. What they're doing is they're just holding the uterus and trying to ligate some vessel here. So here, which vessel comes? It's only the uterine artery. Internal iliac artery is very deep inside the pelvic cavity. So you won't be able to see so superficially. So the answer here is uterine artery ligation. Is it all clear to all of you? No confusion? Yeah. See, the vaginal artery doesn't come here. It will be somewhere lower down. So what they're doing here, you can see the clamp here. They're trying to clamp at this particular position. So what comes there? It's only the uterine artery. Okay. Is it clear to all of you? So we'll go with the last question for today. Now, which hemostatic surgical procedure is demonstrated in the picture below? B-Lynch procedure, uterine artery ligation, vaginal artery ligation, or ovarian artery ligation? Now, since you all have understood the different compression sutures I've explained to you, should be very easy procedure, very easy answer for you to put it up. What is it you can see here?
Uterine artery ligation.
See here, you can see in this picture, they have compressed the uterus, is it not? They have compressed the uterus, and there is also a suture, what you can see here. Can you see additional suture here? Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
This is the uterine incision, and they've sutured that incision separately. Okay. But you can see here, there is a compression. There is a fundal compression. Normally, you won't have all this. Is it not? So there is a compression, and you can see these kind of suspended sutures here, and there is an additional suture which is tied in the front. Okay. So, which is this procedure? It is B-Lynch procedure. Okay, uterine artery will not look like that. Uterine artery ligation will not look like this. We don't tie the uterine artery in the front like this. Okay, so whenever we are doing a uterine artery ligation, what we do is in the broad ligament, we take one bite here and tie this separately, and then we take a bite on the other side or the right side, and then tie this separately. So we don't tie it in front like this in the uterine artery ligation. Remember, this is tied separately, this is tied separately. Okay, so what we do in the B-Lynch procedure, what I explained to you earlier, is we take one bite from the outside, inside the uterine cavity, get it out on the upper side of incision, take it above this on the fundus, go behind, and from posterior you go inside the uterus, again come out posteriorly, come up like this, and then come in the front. Okay, and then take a bite inside, then outside. So you have these two ends left. These two ends are tied tightly, and one assistant will compress the whole of the uterus lower down with the two hands, and then we tie it tightly here. Okay, so that's how you can see these suspension sutures. The fundus is like compressed, and you can see an additional suture here. So this particular picture belongs to which procedure? It is the B-Lynch procedure. Okay, so I hope there is no confusion amongst any of you.
No, ma'am.
Okay, so
No, ma'am.
everything is clear, students?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, anybody has any doubts? How did you feel the presentation or the class?
Oh, good, ma'am.
Very good, ma'am. I like.
Okay, so we have now come to the end of the classes for the postpartum hemorrhage. In the subsequent weeks, we will be covering more topics. Continuing with the hemorrhage topic, what I thought is I'll continue with the topics like abortion or the first trimester bleeding and hemorrhages, conditions which lead to first trimester bleeding. So in the next classes, we will cover those things. Okay, like abortion, ectopic pregnancy, and even hydatidiform mole and all those things we can cover. So that will complete the topics on hemorrhages or the abnormal hemorrhage in obstetrics or pregnancies. Okay, so in the subsequent classes we'll continue about those, and I will be doing it in a similar manner, trying to put up as many multiple choice questions as possible in the topic, and covering the theory part relevantly, explaining to you all the concepts. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Fine. So,
Okay,
is there
ma'am.
anything you
Thank
would
you.
like to share, or any suggestions from your end, students?
No,
No,
Okay,
ma'am.
fine. Thank you all so much then. Have a good night, and see you all in the next week. Please inform your students and sorry, your friends and other colleagues who would be interested to, attend these classes. So I hope you would all be benefited with these classes. So thank you all so much, students. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Good night, ma'am.
Yeah. Good night.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, good night. Bye.